Hello and welcome to Nights at the Game Table. We're at Pat's Games here in Austin, Texas. I am Kevin.
I'm Aryeh.
And tonight we're bringing you a new segment that we are calling Deck Doctors.
To keep up to date with everything at Nights at the Game Table, all you have to do is click subscribe and then hit that tiny little notification button next to it, so every time we upload a new video, YouTube will be sure to let you know.
Today's deck comes from Ryan in Texas, and Ryan writes, I have a deck I built centered around Tatyova Bethic Druid. The idea is that I get as many lands onto battlefield as possible to trigger her landfall ability, and then use all of that mana to kick Slyn Vodda, the Rising Deep, in order to bounce everything except my Merfolk. But I rarely get both pieces of my combo at the same time, and when I don't, the whole deck sort of falls apart. I'm not particularly attached to Slyn Vodda, but I'd love to see a fun deck built around Tatyova that lets me ramp super fast and generates tons of card advantage. It doesn't need to be competitive, but I'd like it to be standard legal. So, we've got a deck here that is aiming to ramp up and bust out some big expensive spells fairly quickly. So we've got Tatyova Bethic Druid, which we're built around, and that's going to be the core of what we do. And that's giving card draw and life for playing extra lands. There's the Slyn Vodda, which might...
Very large Leviathan.
It's a very large Leviathan. I mean, we might keep one of those in there, but it's a bit...
Let's put it this way. Even if we're playing casually, I mean, you don't want to draw two in the same game, right?
You really don't.
No.
And then the kicker cards, I think it's possible there are better things to do with large amounts of mana, right?
Yeah, so one thing that's a staple of this list when we're getting it is that there's Elflame Druid, which is an 0/2 that can tap and kind of give an extra mana for kicker cards. And Ryan has put in like a lot of cards with kicker to try to take advantage of that card, but I think that leads to some cards in the list that don't quite fit.
Quite belong there, yeah. And then there's a few cards in there that don't really fit the theme, particularly a bunch of fairly vanilla creatures, like there's some kind of elemental and some kind of Kavu.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, Untamed Kavu is a cool card, especially with Elflame Druid. It's like a turn 3 5/5, but I don't know if the Kavu is so good that it makes the Druid worth it. You know, like, because if we can remove the Druid from the deck, then we're definitely not playing the Kavu. And is like the turn 3 5/5 Kavu so good that we have to play Elflame Druid? I feel like when the goal of our deck is lands and Tatyova, I don't think so.
Yeah. So, what do you reckon we should do about these Elflame Druids?
Well, there is a different option, a different route we can take for ramping in this deck, and I'm going to go ahead and go with one of my buddies, a card that I enjoy casting, which is Druid of the Cowl.
Druid of the Cowl. Okay, so that's slightly bigger.
It's a 1/3 Llanowar Elf for 2.
Yeah, and I think one of the core weaknesses of this deck is it doesn't really interact with your opponent's board in any way, right? You're just going to get steamrolled fairly quickly if you don't get more out there. So this gives you a warm body.
Yeah, green-blue is always going to be known for having a little more trouble interacting with your opponent's permanents. And so I feel like the Elflame Druid being an 0/2 versus here, if we're able to play Druid of the Cowl, it's going to give us an opportunity to get an actual blocker into play that really can either like just eat a 1/1 token, for example, from like a Legion Warboss, or just block a 2/2, effectively on turn 2, which is going to allow us to survive a few more turns into the game.
Cool. And let's take out most, if not all, of this kicker. And let's also ditch these vanilla-y creatures, this Thorn Elemental, and some other stuff.
Thorn Elemental, it's a sweet card, but at the end of the day, I think that we're trying to get this deck to still be fun, to still be based around Tatyova, but we want our payoff for when we actually get to go off with Tatyova to be a little bit cooler than Thorn Elemental.
For sure, for sure. I think we can keep in Bolas's Clutches, though, right? It's one of the few cards that interacts and really lets you come back after you've got later into the game.
Yeah, and Bolas's Clutches can take Planeswalkers, too.
Yeah.
You can take anything. So your opponent taps out for Teferi, and you're like, in Bolas's Clutches. I think in Bolas's Clutches is definitely going to be one of our good ways for a blue deck to have some form of interaction with the opponent. We are going to trim some of the other high-end stuff for some other maybe slightly stronger cards, like rather than play like the Thorn Elemental, it's sort of a big creature that can just easily die. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to play some Dream Eaters.
Some Dream Eaters?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is a creature that's going to come in and remove one of my opponent's creatures from play.
Any permanent, actually.
Any permanent.
Yeah.
And also give you a nice big surveil to go looking for something else big to follow up with.
Yeah, Surveil is a good ability, like abilities like this Scry or Surveil, or ways to kind of manipulate your deck. Another one that we are including here is Search for Azcanta. These kind of cards are very important in ramp decks, because ramp decks have to play a lot of mana. Like this deck plays 26 land and then like 7 creatures that are also basically like a land, like Llanowar Elf.
So later on you want to be able to find things that are not land.
Right, like we don't
get the payoff.
This is what I tend to refer to as the ramping into nothing strategy, where you have all the mana in the world and nothing to do. So we're trying to avoid that. That's basically what we're doing here.
So Tatyova, let's go up to 4. Let's go all in.
Yeah, the list was sent with 3. A lot of the time with legendary permanents, you don't always want to play 4, but when you're building around the card, it's so important to have the card often that I think we just go ahead and play the full 4.
Okay, so we're going all in on Tatyova, but we're looking to get as many triggers off her as we can. How are we going to set her off?
Well, we are going to be playing a card in almost the exact reverse of what it's usually used for. Okay. We're going to be playing Scapeshift.
You lunatic.
Yeah. Yeah, we're Scapeshifting.
Okay,
we are playing Scapeshift.
Scapeshift is going to let you sacrifice any number of lands that you want and go and get that many lands out of your library.
Correct. So Scapeshift is made famous from Valakut, where it deals like a bunch of damage to your opponent when you cast Scapeshift. We're looking to do like the opposite of that, which is get Tatyova in play, then we can Scapeshift for like 5 or 6, gain a bunch of life, draw a ton of cards, and then just try to win the game from there with one of our bigger threats.
Okay, love it. I'm going to move on to my contribution here, which is the World Shaper.
Yeah, the World Shaper. This is a cool one.
Which I think is just fine. So this is it's a 4-mana 3/3. When it attacks, you get to mill yourself with 3, and do you put a land from your graveyard into play?
I believe that it just mills you for 3.
Oh, it just mills you for 3.
But
when it dies, all lands in your graveyard are going to come out into play. Mm-hmm. So regardless of whether you block with this kind of early and get like a land or 2 extra in, that's fine and gives you another way to interact and trade something off with your opponent. Later on, this could be another big payoff with Tatyova and give you another huge boost of life and cards.
Yeah, so basically in the early game it's just sort of a creature, but in the late game, if it should die and our graveyard is full, it's going to be amazing. And we're going to bring a bunch of lands into play that's going to enable us to, if we have Tatyova, draw a bunch of cards. If we don't, we might find one of our other threats that we are playing in this deck, which is Multani.
Oh, Multani.
Yeah, Multani.
He's a big chap. I'm going to leave in a Slimvoda, right? Just the one, because he's good fun.
We're going to play one Slimvoda because this isn't necessarily the most competitive deck. It's Ryan's deck who sent it in, and we still want to maintain some of that character, you know, because when you're playing in a more casual environment, part of the fun is casting the cards you want to cast. So we're definitely going to leave one Slimvoda in there just because it is a cool card.
For sure.
But we don't want to draw the second one.
Okay. And we're going to slip in a mending of Aryeh as well, right?
Yeah, so our main thing we were looking at, once we were to kind of remove the kicker package, was how do we best like interact with our opponent, and are there other card advantage sort of engines we can get, you know, rolling with this deck, so we're not just like drawing to a bunch of creatures. Mm-hmm. One way we're choosing to do that is by playing Mending of Dominaria. It's kind of a cool card. Sort of mills you at the beginning, and then it can return things, you know, from your graveyard. Works really, really well with the World Shaper.
Okay, and a single River's Rebuke.
Yeah, River's Rebuke, just kind of a catch-all. It just bounces all your opponent's permanents, takes all their permanents, puts them back into their hand. You know, that's going to be, it's not necessarily an effect we want a lot of, but there's a possibility our opponent, especially if they're playing an aggressive deck or they're playing a deck that's got multiple things in play that could be awkward for us, it'll both be a way to set them back and also be a way to kind of bounce their blockers so we can attack for lethal. So it's only like a one spot, but it kind of represents our larger philosophy with changing this deck, which is we want to interact with our opponent a little bit more consistently. Also
gives you something to search for with your Search for Azcanta if you flip that.
Yeah, since we're playing Search for Azcanta just for the card selection anyway, we thought it would also be good to have a nice sorcery that we can find off of it once it flips into Azcanta the Suncover.
Okay. And then there's a couple of 3-drops we're going to be putting in there as well. We've pulled out Jade Light Ranger, as well as the Wayward Sword Tooth.
Yeah, so we're kind of doing this a similar way that I like to do it in Limited, which is we figure out what we're all about. What we're all about is Tatyova, and then we figure out how are we going to get there, and we figured out, okay, that's Llanowar Elves Druid. And we figured out what are we going to do with the big stuff when we finally get all the mana, and we kind of just covered that. So then what's left? What's left is what are we going to do in between? Like, how do we get from Llanowar Elf to Slinvoda? So the answer we came up with was we want 3 mana creatures that have good amount of utility in our deck. So Wayward Swordtooth is going to let us play multiple lands in a turn. Mm-hmm. So for example, we could go like turn 1 Llanowar Elf, turn 2 Swordtooth, and then like play an additional land. That'll get us to Tatyova faster, and also Swordtooth and Tatyova having them play at the same time is awesome because you just play a bunch of lands, draw a bunch of cards. Nice. And Jadelight Ranger is sort of a similar deal, except instead of being you know, like a synergy piece in play, it's kind of a synergy piece that helps us with the top of our deck. Because Jadelight Ranger explores twice, which means that if we have like too many Llanowar Elf type cards, we can get rid of those. If we have too many of the Multani type cards, we can like get rid of some of those. So
and we can draw some lands.
Yeah, like this deck needs to draw a mix of ramp creatures, Tatyovas, and big cards. And Jadelight Ranger is just a nice way of bridging the gap there.
Cool. What else do we have that we thought about but decided not to go with, but might be an option for people who want to play with this a bit further?
I think we talked for a little while about whether we should play cards like Carnage Tyrant, which is like a 7/6 hexproof that's uncounterable. You know, you might want to go in a direction like that, especially if you're playing against a lot of people who have a ton of removal spells or counter spells. You know, a different way of doing it would be like, rather than go for the more synergistic pieces that we've done, like where we keep Multani because it counts lands, comes back from the graveyard, you know, instead of having stuff like that, we would go for the threats that are a lot harder to answer. Like Carnage Tyrant is like a 7/6 uncounterable hexproof, like
it's
trample.
pretty big.
Like, yeah, that card is challenging for your opponent to deal with if they're trying to play black cards.
Something I just remembered we should have brought up is the mana base. So
yes.
Ideally we want to go to 4 Hinterland Harbors?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when you originally got the list, it had less than 4 Hinterland Harbor, which in a deck like this, 2-color deck, it's got islands, it's got forests. We should definitely have the full 4. Another thing we noticed though is the deck didn't have Evolving Wilds in it.
And Evolving Wilds has got all kinds of synergy. It could work with Many of Dominaria, it could work with World Shaper, but particularly, of course, you've got the double trigger of Tatyova Bethic Druid.
Yeah, so if you can ramp Tatyova, get her into play like before turn 5, like maybe, you know, turn 3 or 4 or something like that off of some elves, then you can play Evolving Wilds, crack it, it's immediate draw 2.
Draw 2, gain 2.
You draw 2 cards the turn she comes in. That's a huge swing that even if your opponent can now answer her with some kind of a removal spell, that's a 3-for-1.
Yeah, that's really nice,
my friend. So that's a really good one.
Another card I thought about was Crucible of Worlds, which could let you replay your Evolving Wilds from the graveyard potentially indefinitely.
Yeah, Crucible, it lets you kind of replay lands from the graveyard. There's definitely a build of this that would be more heavily graveyard focused, where we might start even looking into a 3-color type of a deck with some Golgari cards.
Yeah, some Surveil as well, maybe.
Yeah, like there's something there that could happen, but that was pretty far from the list we received originally, so we wanted to kind of stick to Ryan's vision while editing a little bit.
Cool. Anything else you want to add?
This deck seems really fun.
I want to build this, and I want to scape shift off and see what happens.
It's just the moment that we were looking at the list and started talking about scape shift, both of us just started smiling.
You were scape shift, and I was like, really, scape shift, and then I was like, whoa, really, scape shift.
Yeah. Once we realized that scape shift was the answer, the whole deck became a lot more fun, a lot more exciting. I mean, I just can imagine you're playing a casual game and like, you know, like your opponent's like doing whatever, and then you're just like, okay, like draw 10, scape shift, like discard 2 Multanis, I'll return those to my hand a little later. Oh my gosh, seems like a ton of fun.
A lot of fun. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for joining us for Deck Doctors. We would love to hear what you think about this new feature. And if you want us to look at your deck list, join us in our Facebook group, Game Talk for Gamers, and post in there. We'll be looking out for you, and we'll be picking another list to be going through next week. And if you've enjoyed this video, please click the subscribe link down below, and we will catch you next time on Knights at the Game Table.